I was horrified by the bombing of Libya because I saw a president who called himself the first black president bomb an African country. And I was very confused because it looked, sounded, and smelled just like something the Bush Jr. administration would do. Use a pretext of authoritarianism and this dictator is committing human rights abuses as a reason to destroy a country. And then I started learning about Libya, the most prosperous African country at that time, subsidies, um, subsidies for oil, for housing. People lived quite well. They participated in direct democracy, free housing, free education, etc. And of course, yes, it was the richest country in Africa at that time, also aided in the anti-apartheid struggle and many other liberation movements, Muammar Gaddafi being someone who called himself not only an Arab nationalist, but a revolutionary. So very inspiring stuff. And then Syria happened, right? Syria happened, and it happened right after, I mean, it happened at the same time. You had these protests happening in Syria, similar to the Libyan model. And actually, I learned later that a lot of these these foreign proxies that were fighting in Libya at the behest of NATO, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., actually were moving on to Syria to start staging these quote unquote protests, picking up weapons in the border regions, and beginning their terror, their reign of terror. And so as I started to learn more about this and follow the journalists covering this, and those folks who were going out there like Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett, I started to understand exactly how fraudulent this war was. And I couldn't predict, although I had a bad feeling that it would last a long time, because every time the United States tried to pull a Libya 2.0 on Syria through a no-fly zone, it would fail. It failed in August of 2014, and it continued to fail onward, no matter how much it tried to fabricate chemical weapons accusations and all of that. It failed because guess what? Russia intervened in 2015 on the side of the Syrian government at their invitation, and that alone prevented Libya 2.0 from happening. And that's just the facts. Russia prevented, honestly, what would have been the biggest disaster that the Middle East had seen since the invasion of Iraq, but it would have had even more consequences because it would have been another domino. The instability would have been incredible, and it would have leaked and poured into Russia and further east. And that's why Russia had every interest in protecting the legitimacy of the Syrian government. So that war raged on years and years. And in 2016, the Battle of Aleppo, there were huge victories, right? Huge victories in Raqqa and Aleppo. Of course, Idlib remained divided, a kind of a staging ground for the foreign proxies funded by by NATO and its statelets. And after 2016, there was a stasis. The battle had basically been won on the ground militarily by Syria, but the United States and, of course, NATO would not allow such an occurrence to continue. So what did they do? They placed Caesar sanctions on Syria. They starved Syria's economy, and the U.S. remained an occupying force in a third of Syria in its northeastern region, basically stealing its water, its wheat, and its oil, where 30%, where a large percentage of its oil, 30% of its land and a large percentage of its oil is now being occupied. So that has continued. And that has continued in large part because regional countries in the Arab um, periphery in the Arab world went along, right? They went along. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, et cetera, et cetera. They went along, and they had also their own conflicts now to fight, like, for example, in Yemen. Well, now everything has changed. Everything has changed in a matter of, it's a flurry of changes. We're talking about changes unseen in a century, right? That Xi Jinping told Vladimir Putin. Seismic changes, cataclysmic changes. And it all points to US hegemony dying. And it's dying because, well, let's just look at some of these developments. Number one, the huge peace agreement brokered in Beijing between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Before that, you had the China Arab Summit in Riyadh, led by Saudi Arabia in large part. After these developments, you also had the normalization between Turkey and Syria begin to occur. Talks between their foreign ministers, their defense ministers. You also had Saudi Arabia and Syria begin to have serious discussions. And now, in just the last couple of days, you've had Syria readmitted back into the Arab League in conjunction with the end of the Yemen war. So you had two intense wars backed by the United States, and in a matter of months, the war on Yemen, which was largely U.S. backed, led by Saudi Arabia, and the war on Syria now over with its readmittance into the Arab League. And why is it over? And I'm going to play a clip from the Duran very soon because what they have to say is I think, very smart and astute on this. But it's over because Saudi Arabia, which was the principal actor in backing the forces that were invading Syria throughout the dirty war, the proxy war, Saudi Arabia came together, its foreign minister came together with Bashar al-Assad and normalized relations. They reopened embassies. In their statement, Saudi Arabia said, we recognize the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, and we will no longer fund and arm and support, I think they just said support, any force outside of that government. Huge. That is the end of the war on Syria. And I could never have predicted it, but it is great news for peace. It is what China is calling an atmosphere of peace blowing over the Middle East. And it's incredible. And in large part, it's because of China. It's because of what China was able to do between Saudi Arabia and Iran, be able to balance these relationships. It's absolutely inspiring, and we should all be inspired by this development. And so let's hear what the folks at the Duran have to say about this, and I'll make some comments, and we can go forward from there. So let's see what they have to say.
All right, Alexander, the big news coming out of Syria back in the Arab League. And this was expected, but now it's official. We've been expecting it for the past couple of weeks, but now it is official. And the U.S. is absolutely furious. The Biden White House is very upset with this development. But the Arab League, it seems like they don't really care. They're not so concerned with the warnings and angry rhetoric coming out of Washington, which I think is a story in and of itself. Yes. But Syria is back in the Arab League.
Let's talk about it, because I mean this is the end of the Syrian war. I mean, if you want to put your finger on the date when the Syrian war ended, this decision confirms it. There is no real fighting any longer going on in Syria. There are certain areas of Syria which are still outside the Syrian government's control, but they are not controlled by insurgencies that are fighting the Syrian government. They are occupied, they're territories that are occupied by outsiders, by the Turks in the north and by the United States in the east. Now, the Turks are trying to disengage. They're trying to find ways of extricating themselves and leaving these territories and doing a deal with Damascus in order to achieve that. So that part of the war is going to end very soon. That only leaves the American occupied territories in the east, which straightforwardly, it's now just a question of the US being there. It's no longer, as I said, part of any kind of civil war. That is finished. Assad won. He survived. He survived with the help of the Russians and the Iranians. He came very close at one point to losing. He never panicked. He never fled. He never lost his cool. Apparently, there were moments when the insurgents were just a couple of hundred meters from his palace, his residence, but he never left. He saw it out and he's won. And he's now reintegrated fully into the Arab League, the Arab family of nations. He's now once again best friends with the Saudis and all those. So he is the big winner in the Syrian war. The other big winner, of course, is Russia and, of course, Iran. And, of course, the Iranians now have their rapprochement with the Saudis going, and the Saudis have seen the way This has all worked out with Assad winning in the way that he did win, and they've changed their alignments. They've decided that they're going to distance themselves from the US. They're going to go with the Chinese and the Russians. They're going to rebuild their relations with Iran. They're going to seek peace with their neighbors. They're no longer prepared to work with the US in the way that they did. We've discussed that side of things extensively in our programs. But this decision to readmit Syria into the Arab League, which could not have happened without the agreement of the Saudis, that is conclusive. That seals both the fact that the Syrian war is over and that Assad has won, and the realignment of Saudi Arabia away from the United States.
I mean, that's just the facts, right? The facts is that there has been a realignment. And that's another thing that I don't think any of us, I mean, perhaps there are people a little more astute than me who could have seen that coming. But I just remember over let's say the first 10 years of the dirty war on Syria, there was no movement. Saudi Arabia was very committed. Saudi Arabia disconnected and completely severed ties with the Syrian government. Saudi Arabia was funding and arming these proxies. And Saudi Arabia was then engaging in another war in Yemen. It was really, truly overextending itself. But one of the ways that it prevented overextending itself directly was by not investing forces directly into Syria, just funding armed groups, which Saudi Arabia has a history of doing in league with the United States. But in the first 10 years of that war, 2011 to 2021, there wasn't much movement. But then Biden comes along. The Biden administration comes along, and it's so very interesting that Biden comes along, and what happens? What happens is that the Biden administration begins its crusade against Russia and imperils the entire world economy, including the energy sector, which, well, we don't have to be very astute to understand that Saudi Arabia lives by this sector. This is the black gold that Saudi Arabia relies upon to develop its economy. So Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and the rest were not too happy when they saw these sanctions target Russia and the United States look at the world as basically a playground from which to stomp on. And so Saudi Arabia began to think very hard, and the realignment was very rapid. Now, Russia, China, and Saudi relations were not bad before this. They weren't poor. It's simply to say that they were more imbalanced before. Saudi Arabia was much more keen, even during the Trump era, to express its willingness and closeness to the United States, its willingness to be close to the United States. That's no more. Those days are over, right? The fact that Saudi Arabia was willing to normalize in China with Iran, which has been in Saudi Arabia's mind a sworn enemy, that is a huge deal, both based on sectarian purposes, based on political reasons, also based on economic competition, and also based on Saudi's mission for a long time to scratch the US's back so that it could also get scratched. It has decided no more. And that's a big part of this story, is Syria has benefited mightily from what is a realignment caused by the U.S. itself. The U.S. has basically destroyed its own hegemony in the Middle East. And you know what? It's a beautiful thing. Let's continue for a little longer.
Yeah, he always kept his cool. He never wore sweatshirts and green camouflage. He would make public appearances with a suit and tie. There were no green screens. There were no big media productions. The people, I think the Syrian people, I think it's fair to say they never turned on Assad either, even though they faced immense pressure as well.
No, they never turned on Assad. Actually, it's quite the opposite. They didn't turn on Assad. They supported Assad more and more and more that the war went on. The longer and longer and longer it went on, the more that the Syrian people came around Assad. Whatever differences they had politically, religiously, culturally, whatever differences they had in terms of policy. First off, Assad was very keen on conceding to opposition forces in the beginning, and he made very smart moves along with the Ba'ath Party to expand the scope of governance and to include the opposition in deliberations and empower them in politics to a degree, not to take over, of course, but to a degree. And that allowed for relief and a kind of isolating of these proxy forces from the political realm, which was genius. But he's exactly right. Alex Christopher is exactly right here. That's what happens. He never abandoned the Syrian people, and the Syrian people thanked him for that.
To turn on Assad, they stuck with it as well, and they showed that that they're not going to be intimidated either. I mean, is that a fair assessment to make as well?
It is a completely fair assessment. I mean, he never lost his hold over the Syrian people. On the contrary, the war consolidated his leadership of Syria. He has been seen by the Syrian people as the symbol of their struggle against the forces that were trying to overthrow him, which were backed by external powers. And it's ended up by making his position in Syria much stronger than it had been before. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to stress again that the war that happened in Syria had both external actors and internal causes. I mean, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there were many problems inside Syria. You can't start a war like this unless there were problems within Syria itself. And there clearly were. And we'll see how and whether Assad is able to address them in the long term. But over the course of the war, his leadership has greatly consolidated. He came to be seen by the Syrian people, particularly the Syrian people in the cities, as the person who, as I said, was stood by them. As I say, he never ran away. He never lost his dignity or calm. And they, in return, stood by him.
Yeah.
So that's all I wanted to play from that video. I think that's, those guys are exactly right. And stay tuned. They will be here on this channel, I believe May 19th. So a little over a week from now to talk about Ukraine, talk about these developments and others on this channel. But I wanted to play that because of that point, right? This is a very key point. And I think it's not really talked about so often. It's one that's hard to make because, as I said before about Russia, Syria is included in this as well, China. When it comes to countries that the neocons are ranting and raving about in order to satisfy and spread their warmongering propaganda so that they can wage wars as successfully as they can, there's a demonization campaign, an intense demonization campaign. And Syria has perhaps been subject to one of the most intense in the last 2 generations. The allegations of being an Assadist just for challenging U.S. propaganda, the allegations that Assad was butchering his own people, was just some dictator, all was meant to get the Western populaces behind a completely and utterly dirty war, which also had its very significant possible consequences given Russia's participation in this conflict as well, right? We can see Syria as a precursor to Ukraine in a lot of ways because Russia became involved in Syria and changed the calculus to the extent that the United States and its NATO forces, its allies, had to now contend with Russian forces on the ground. Fighting ISIS, fighting these so-called jihadists, these proxies of the Gulf countries, of Israel, and of the United States, the CIA, and the Pentagon themselves. They were funding these forces directly. And so it's really important to note how Syria's leadership is a big reason why Syria was able to survive this war. It could have been very easy for Syria to essentially dissolve. I mean, the onslaught was just brutal. We're talking about massacres, slaughters, invasions of people dedicated to terrorizing the population. And then at the same time, Syria was isolated economically. Syria was, they tried to make an example out of Syria as look at what we can do. You're another domino to fall, and it will be an even bigger and badder domino than the dominoes that we were able to push over in prior periods. That was the goal of overthrowing Syria. It was to get to Russia. It was to get to China. It was to continue to push east to solidify U.S. and collectivist hegemony, and to ensure that the entire world would watch as an independent sovereign government that had a reputation of pushing back against U.S. imperial interests would not be able to function in a region that the U.S. had long called essentially its stomping grounds, essentially key to its prosperity and national security. So it's important to recognize the accomplishments of someone like Assad. You saw in that video Bashar al-Assad walking casually in street clothes without extra security detail, being able to mingle and communicate and connect with the people in a war zone, in a time of war, an invasion, to consolidate popularity. I mean, 80+% of the Syrian people support Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'ath Party. That is just facts. And it's important to note this because it's the case everywhere where there is a fight back against this agenda, of total domination, full spectrum dominance from the United States and its vassals. Whether you're looking at Russia, Syria, Iran, yes, but China too, you have these governments essentially be some of the most legitimate in the world. And that's because people like their independence, especially countries like Syria, a French colony at one point, and of course has been facing interference from the United States for a long time. Even pre-war on terror, there was CIA interventionism inside of Syria. When you have that dynamic, when you have that history, right, it's important to note that people are going to like a fight back. So if Syria and Bashar al-Assad were going to take the reins and say, well, we are the rightful defenders of the country and of the people, then you better believe that the Syrian people are going to respond with unity and with resistance. And that's what they did. And it's such a beautiful moment now that it's coming to fruition, that their effort was not in vain, that now the globe is changing with their struggle. And that is the hope and the aim, I think, all countries that are resisting this scourge should aim for. Syria is really inspirational. It's one of the reasons why I got into this work in the first place, was because of Syria's steadfast resistance, that other countries, right, were not able to do that. Were not able to muster that kind of resistance because conditions were different. But Syria was able to take stock of the situation and was able to leverage its partnerships. And Russia was smart enough to understand that Syria was existential for it. And China was also smart enough to understand that Libya was a big debacle and that Russia and China did not fulfill their duties at that time because they misread the U.S.'s unhinged neocon interventionism. They did. They underestimated it. They believed truly that a no-fly zone was not an act of war. And then they learned that it was going to be used as an act of war in Syria. And so, lessons like Yugoslavia, lessons like the first Iraq invasion, all these lessons are ones that need to be taken stock of. And Syria, China, Russia, they've all learned them, right? They learn these lessons and they learn them to the tune of fighting back successfully. And so it is a beautiful moment that Syria is now back in the Arab League, that Syria is ready to reintegrate itself into regional affairs, that it is no longer under the same kind of threat regionally, that Israel looks like the most isolated country in the Middle East at this point, and that the United States' hegemony in this region is declining. That its hegemony is not just declining, but actually in many ways, it's over, right? Its hegemony is over. It doesn't have, it doesn't have what it had a decade ago, 2 decades ago. It doesn't have the legitimacy. People don't want it. People don't want U.S. dominance.